Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be ever pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. You may have noticed our worship both today and on this past Wednesday looked a little different. Lots of these and thous. A lot of us who've been Episcopalian for some time know that this service is in Rite 1. Usually our services are in Rite 2. Our prayer book has two forms of sacred ritual that we can use for our Sunday Eucharist service. And the short explanation is that Rite 1 is traditional language and Rite 2 is contemporary language. Rite 1, however, the service we have today is the way that Episcopalians worshipped for many centuries. Some people sitting here grew up with this language, which we now call Rite 1. And we'll be worshiping in Rite 1 for Lent and for Advent. Rite 1 is a special service, and it's not special for nostalgic reasons. We all know how nostalgia can be a double-edged sword, or a bittersweet contradiction. There never were a good old days. Sorry, but... And Rite 1 is special not because it is somehow more penitential than Rite 2. We may fall under that impression that Rite 1 is more penitential because it speaks so highly of God. It speaks so highly of God in His majesty and in His holiness and in His perfection, in contrast to us down here in our imperfection. We humans hear holiness, and that may conjure up feelings of fear. I can't tell you how many people, when I walk around in public with my collar, straighten up their manner when they see me. Like I'm going to summon a lightning bolt down on them or something. Not everyone. I actually had this past weekend in the gas station, I ran into someone who found me very approachable and wanted me to pray for them. So it's not everyone. But a lot of us, understandably, think of holiness as something unapproachable, something we are unworthy of touching or seeing or approaching or being in the presence of. But God's holiness is something that we do not have to be afraid of. But it is something we can adore. It is not something we need to run away from. You can try to run away from it, but you won't actually be able to do it. But there is a reason why God is holy and we are not. If we were holy by our own selves, we wouldn't know what to do with it. God, by His nature, is holy, and we, by our nature, are not. Theologians of old have called this the infinite qualitative difference. Sounds like an economic term or something. But it means you and I are nothing like God. But God desires, nevertheless, to know the world that we inhabit. And God desires to know the path that you trod. Jesus meets us in this path today, in the desert, facing, like we often do, temptation. Who's been tempted to do something this week they know they shouldn't have? Not a lot of hands, but thanks for your honesty for the couple people that did. But on a real note, Jesus knows what that is like. And our temptations vary. There's all kinds. Lust, money, we all know them. And often temptation it works because it promises us immediate satisfaction. Or it's something we mistake as an easy solution or a fix to a problem that we are trying to ignore, or we're trying not to willingly face it honestly. Cutting corners. And when we cut corners long enough, we end up with a circle that keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, limiting us more and more to a point where we are lost in our own isolated, alienated world of self. That's the destruction of sin. Thanks be to God, that desolate landscape we find ourselves in is where Jesus finds himself in today. Paul writes in our epistle reading today, "Therefore, just as one man's trespass led to the condemnation of all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all." Let's talk about this one man's trespass. In the story of Genesis, we have the prototype tale of how we in our humanity seek to find immediate satisfaction in any place that we think we have found it promised to us. We all have longings and desires on our hearts. We are each born longing for fulfillment and peace for ourselves, for a sense of validation and acceptance and accomplishment. God gave us the desire for these things. It's not a sign of weakness or selfishness. We seek them for us, and we seek them for those we love. But how do we go about seeking these? Where do we find our security? Where do we find acceptance and a sense of accomplishment? These are things that we literally spend all of our time, energy, and efforts in order to have. And what happens when we spend all our time and all our energy thinking we have finally gained for ourselves the fulfillment we sought for, and then whatever it is that we accomplish in order to have that fulfillment, whatever thing we attained in order to find it, is then lost or taken from us, or as we find out, did not in fact give us that fulfillment we thought we would find. That dream or hope for our life that we chased, that didn't come true. Where does that leave us? In part, ashamed. What a fool I was to invest all my time, to devote myself entirely to that. All for what? The dream is over. Suddenly we wake up and our eyes are opened. Take a look at that last sentence of our first reading from Genesis in our bulletin. What happens after Adam and Eve realized what they had done? What happens after they realized that this hope they had of having all the knowledge, that this promise that they will know all things, that they will be masters knowing all things good and evil, provided they eat this fruit, didn't come true? They're ashamed. And out of shame and embarrassment of themselves, they hide themselves. They hide themselves, they in their most vulnerable form a human can be, is something they cannot accept about themselves, and they cover it up. How could God love us now? Many of us felt that. That I'm undesirable, unlovable, because I failed to reach the thing I sought out to do. And because I thought that empty promise really had something to it if I met its conditions. Notice in the beginning of the story, God puts man and woman in the garden with everything they would need for their fulfillment. God did not leave man and woman to have to fend for themselves. He gave them abundance of all they would need in order that they would not have to fend for themselves. But instead, man and woman decided they wanted to fend for themselves. How tempting, how alluring to be self-made. But then we give into that temptation, and we realize that we cannot handle fending for ourselves. We cannot handle creating a paradise for ourselves. And the lushness of the life that we thought we could get by our own way is lost. In the place of the garden, we find ourselves in the desolate wilderness, walking aimlessly and ashamed. And then someone comes along. Someone comes and ventures into that desolate wilderness. And that person enters the desolate wilderness not looking for immediate satisfaction, but instead goes without food and water. That person enters the desolate wilderness not seeking fulfillment, but self-emptying and denial. This person enters the desert not hiding and covering himself, but exposing his mortal body to the elements. That person enters the desert and meets the same foe of which man and woman face every day. And he denies this foe any influence it can have to determine what will be. This person enters the wilderness and is not overtaken by it. This person enters the wilderness and makes it once again the garden. This person enters the desolation and brings abundance. He enters the desolation of our lives, and he gives us abundance. He does this for you because he loves you. And that love he has for you fulfills you. God is holy in himself, but he doesn't keep it for himself, but invites us to share in holiness with him by gifting it to you and by making you holy, by restoring you to the image of which he created and originally desired for you in the garden. How much more meaningful it is when we speak of holiness this way. Therefore, just as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. Amen.